Where Mexicans Fit in the New American Racial Order by Gomez L. In this article, the author confronts the lie that America spreads about how they, quote unquote, peacefully annexed new territories, and that the inhabitants living there, like the Native Americans and Mexicans, quote unquote, welcomed them. In his supporting arguments, Gomez talks about the history of the racial inequality of the colonized regions of Latin America. He states that during the Spanish occupation of Latin America, everyone, including elites of all races, jockeyed for the position and defined themselves and others in an undeniably multiracial terrain. At this time, the Spanish knew that they could not effectively rule over Latin America without there being racial mixing. So, there was a massive caste system that was created where different racial groups were marginalized and put in almost a uh, pyramid of importance, with those who had primarily Spanish ancestry being at the very top, while those who had more mixed blood, such as someone who had a African father and a native mother, would be lower on the bracket. This resulted in a lot of racial, because of the colonizers, there was a lot of racial mixing and, as I just mentioned, caste system. This was the main form of colonization that Latin America experienced for the first for a for a long time, and under it, it resulted in a whole different issue. You see, there was even subclasses within each class as well. An example being in Native American groups, there were labels of more Spanish Native Americans, which were Native Americans that adapted to or embraced certain parts of Spanish culture, such as the Christian religion, or, were able to speak Spanish fluently, lived in Spanish towns, so on. Or they were, if they were not as willing to uh, change their ways and uh, maintain their more native culture, they were seen as barbarians and savages. And mind you, this was spread throughout all of the Latin American colonized areas. So even if you had Native American in you, there was a very good chance that uh like depending on where what part of the caste system you were under, you would also be against certain Native American groups. An example was the Iroquois, who experienced frequent discrimination. Hmm. Afterwards, but much later, the U.S. Eventually took over some of these territories. And as I just described, it was a very culturally diverse area, and areas such as New Mexico became ostracized and discriminated against, primarily due to their population. The majority of the population, Mexicans, were to, quote, occupy an off-white position and for the group overall to be classified as an inferior mongrel race, totally incapable of self-governing. This was the primary dominant view of the Mexican community during this time, with a lawyer even being deployed into the new territories, avidly describing the Mexican people as savages and gross people. Oh, especially how they described it. This lawyer described the woman. Fortunately, this is very common, with even the New York Times pushing this narrative. And eventually, um, eventually, the only way for New Mexico to even gain statehood, which is they were pushing for, was when LeBron Bradford Prince pushed his progressive, and I say that in quotations, view, which contained lies such as the tricultural harmony. Gomez states that this tricultural harmony only resulted in displacing the long, complex history of intergroup conflict. To briefly explain the tricultural harmony, functionally, it stated that the U.S. Euro Americans came over and helped provide certain things to the uh, native people and Mexicans, and in return, the Mexican people showed their Spanish culture, specifically their architecture and language, and the Native Americans showed their lifestyle as well. However, this was primarily seen as degrading as well, where it put them down for having more past influences versus the forward seeking white people, which is how it was described. This experience is defined under the key terms as double colonization, which the author describes as various racial groups who inhabited the region in the mid 19th century were forced to navigate two racial regimes simultaneously. This is in reference to the Spanish colonization of the Native Americas and the Latin Americas, and the U.S. takeover of these territories, such as New Mexico. The progressive view, defined by the author as Mexican Americans, were considered a more benign presence, largely because its proponents emphasized Mexican Americans' glorious Spanish past as conquerors of Indians, primarily avoiding the topic that almost every Mexican had some Native American within them, almost every Mexican had some Spaniard in them, almost every Mexican had some combination of different racial mixing within them. The dominant view, unfortunately, was even worse, as it was described by the author as Mexican Americans were characterized as unfit for self government because they were of inferior racial stock. In understanding and applying this knowledge, we see that the race of the Latin American community continues to be discussed as an issue today. The MAGA party is pushing the colonist mindset described in Discourse on Colonialism, which, quote, we aspire not to equality, but to domination. The country of a foreign race must become once again a country of serfs. It is not a question of eliminating the inequalities among men, but widening them and making them into law. Furthermore, the current administration is trying to delete the history of marginalized communities to sanitize the history of the U.S. Gomez, on the other hand, is pushing the truth of its history. The current treatment and past treatment of the locals, the othering of them, and far more has been utterly unjustified. Therefore, the USA needs to take accountability for its actions, both past and present, and stop sanitizing its history. As Freire puts it in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the same is true with respect to the individual oppressor as a person. Discovering himself to be an oppressor may cause considerable anguish, but does not necessarily lead to solidarity with the oppressed. In other words, for us to actively understand our history and to make the world better, for there to be less oppression, we need to not only understand the real truth of our history, but also the fact that we have to come together. Those who had power, white people, need to acknowledge that what white people have done historically was not good. However, now to my analysis, I did come across a couple questions as I was reading this. My first question being, why did Gomez focus on New Mexico and not as much on all the other territories that experienced double colonization, such as the territories of California, Texas, and so on? With how difficult it was for New Mexico to attain statehood, surely these other territories would have also struggled to obtain it with most of their native population either being Native American or Mexican. The only way I can imagine this not being the case is sadly the combination of displacing locals and the flooding in of white Americans. Another question that came to my mind was while it was explained how Prince was frequently rewriting history in order to push his narrative, how could focusing on Mexicans' Spanish ancestry really help Mexicans be viewed in any better light? Now, this may sound redundant, as the author does explain pretty frequently that this whiteness this whiteness could help. However, I question that at the same time, as the U.S. has fought Spain on multiple occasions, and it to me sounds like with how the New York Times describes people who speak Spanish, it surely would have been unpopular just to be Spanish, period, let alone be Mexican. So I don't really see how there would have been a massive improvement if if they were considered white. That's all. Thank you, and have a good day.